This is the story of Joseph James DeAngelo, the calculating killer who hid in plain sight for over 40 years. His crimes contradicted the vows he took as a young man. His sworn promise to serve and protect clearly didn't matter.
A frail old man is being accused of monstrous crimes.
Joseph James DeAngelo, your true and correct legal name?
But looking at this 72-year-old now, only an angry glare gives away any hint that for decades, Joseph James DeAngelo was America's most wanted man.
Joseph James DeAngelo was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, to a strict militaristic family. His father was a sergeant in the United States Army, and he had two older sisters and a younger brother. Due to his father's service, his family was constantly on the move, stationed all across a battered Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Having no patience for the antics of growing and sprightly youth, their father often beat them into submission for any insolence that may have shined poorly on him to his superiors. Joseph was exposed to violence from a young age from both his father and those who he fraternized with on the bases on which they were stationed. Still riled from the bloodiest war, many soldiers found new outlets for their bloodlust, often at the expense of the innocent. DeAngelo was exposed to one such instance as a young boy when he and his older sister were playing unsupervised in a warehouse. He was held at bay while two airmen took advantage of his 7-year-old sibling. The crime went unpunished, and his father beat him into silence, believing he was lying about the abuse. His family finally settled back in the States in 1959, where he attended both middle and high school in Rancho Cordova, California. Suppressed by his dismissive parents, he found other ways to vent his bubbling rage in these years, participating in sports teams, his only healthy egress. His other avenues of expression came in the form of both burglary and animal abuse, much going unreported due to his father's pressures against any who might stain his family's reputation. Joseph was instead punished in the privacy of his own home, beaten brutally for any deviance that came to light. DeAngelo received his GED in 1964 and promptly joined the Navy to participate in the Vietnam War. He served for 22 months as a mechanic aboard 2 separate warships before returning to California and attending college, earning a bachelor's degree in criminal justice by 1971. Completing 2 further years of police training, Joseph eventually found himself taking the oath of law enforcement, working in a burglary response unit in the Exeter Police Department in 1973. But was the shield he wore simply a cover for his own ill intents? His childhood rage followed him, and his superiors often saw themselves reprimanding him for his brutality while on the beat. He was also suspected of theft of many confiscated items, an echo of his teenage years as a known burglar. No matter his superiors' efforts to reel him into step, he maintained his problematic behavior. But in 1975, another of his young habits reared its head in an excessively violent manner. Joseph had been stalking a young girl named Elizabeth Snelling in September of 1975, and on the 10th, he decided to act on his impulses and break into her bedroom window in an attempt to abduct her at gunpoint. Her father woke to the commotion after she screamed in surprise, and DeAngelo shot the man dead with his police-issued pistol before kicking Elizabeth in the face 3 times and fleeing into the night. The crime was committed 10 miles outside the jurisdiction of Exeter, and a connection was never made. In early 1976, Joseph transferred to Auburn, California, nearly 300 miles north of Exeter, and continued as a beat cop. Though he brought with him his serious, hot-headed demeanor, and his superiors butted heads with him on multiple occasions. He continued here for nearly 3 years before he was arrested by his own co-workers for shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent spray. When the chief of police fired him, DeAngelo threatened his life before storming out and stalked the man for weeks, often being sighted in the area around his home. DeAngelo was always known by his family to have a temper, but after this loss, his brother noticed a stark change, an unwillingness to accept facts, and an infatuation with certain topics. Around the time of his dismissal from service, news outlets overflowed with stories of a series of break-ins and unspeakable acts against women. Whenever he had a chance to bring up the topic, he would get excessively aggressive. When his family tried to steer the conversation away, neighbors would often call police over the loud arguments that ensued. Neither his family nor his agitated neighbors would realize that this was more than a sick interest in a taboo topic. The stories of assault landed much closer to home than anyone realized, and the viciousness would only serve to escalate in the days to come. On February 22nd, 1978, following a series of 5 break-ins and violations, a couple who was walking their dog confronted Joseph as he fled the scene of the crime, and he pulled his pistol on them, shooting them in the back as they fled for their lives. Their names were Brian and Katie Majwar, and following their deaths, DeAngelo hurriedly moved to Santa Barbara, knowing that their very public deaths would draw too much attention to his crimes. The killings had no lapse. The assaults became much more brazen. Joseph broke into the homes of couples, tying up the men and covering their faces with bags or clothing, while the women were taken advantage of. Oftentimes, he would place dishes on the backs of the husbands and threaten if he heard them rattling, he would kill their wives without hesitation. No matter their obedience, he murdered them both regardless, either with a blunt object or an execution-style gunshot, before taking expensive objects to pawn, or even various forms of identification as trophies. The man spread terror amongst the populace beyond the confines of his crimes. Letters, poems, suspicious phone calls spread throughout the state as his rampage continued. His first known assault victim received a call on January 2nd, 1978, where the only thing she could hear on the other line was loud breathing, grunting, and a gravelly voice mumbling repeatedly. 4 days later, a local counseling line was phoned, and a man confessed to multiple murders before claiming he needed help stopping. Minutes later, he became suspicious and hung up after accusing the counselor of tracing his call. His murderous rampage between 1978 and 1981 cost over a dozen lives and left over 50 women violated. Authorities began to refer to him as the Night Stalker, until Richard Ramirez's rise just a few years later, and eventually the East Area Rapist. These two titles were originally believed to be two separate killers until the advent of the 2000s, where they were linked by a correlating MO and DNA collected from the victims over the years. Even though his crimes seemed to end after 1985, countless investigators, both official and civilian, searched tirelessly for him, using any means they could. For nearly 20 years, the case would go unsolved, but a clue from an unexpected source brought the case dominoing ahead at a pace that staggered everyone involved. In 2016, after years of persistent investigation by dozens of investigators, including actor Patton Oswalt's wife, Michelle McNamara, who wrote countless articles about the crimes and coined his new moniker, the Golden State Killer, a decision was made to register the killer's DNA on a genealogy website in an attempt to find relatives based on similar genetic material. Over 1,000 people were linked to the DNA, and months of systematic narrowing of suspects based on age, location, profession, and other pertinent factors, until only one suspect remained: Joseph James DeAngelo. A pair of new DNA samples were collected from his car door handle, as well as a tissue collected from his garbage. When the samples were tested alongside the DNA collected from the victims, it was an undeniable match. And on April 24th, 2018, police surrounded the home of his daughter and granddaughter, expecting a difficult intervention. But when an infirm-looking man in a wheelchair was wheeled out the front door, everybody reeled in disbelief that this frail figure was ever able to commit such atrocities. After his arrest, Joseph admitted to prosecutors that he had been battling with an inner demon named Jerry, that he took control and forced him to commit these depraved acts throughout the years. Both this and the crimes leveled against him came as a complete shock to his family, who believed him to be a kind, loving, stable family man. The evidence, however, was undeniable. Before long, his multiplicitous excuses fell by the wayside, and he began to own up to his crimes. He was charged with 13 counts of murder and kidnapping, though the over 50 counts of sexual assault and 120 counts of burglary could not be charged due to the statute of limitations. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty, even though it was outlawed in the state of California, and DeAngelo eventually took a plea deal where he admitted to each murder and kidnapping he committed. Following days worth of victim testimony, Joseph gave a short apology. "I've listened to all of your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." This was the story of Joseph James DeAngelo. It took the combined efforts of multiple generations of law enforcement, citizen investigators, and even celebrities to finally bring him to bear for his crimes. His tale goes to show how entire communities can accomplish the impossible with the clever use of unexpected methods in order to achieve their ends. That those who are reviled enough will inevitably come to face justice. What other cold cases are out there, and what other community is determined and dogged enough to find those responsible? I guess we'll have to wait and see.